Hi, I'm Jeff Nyquist, and this is another edition of Friends and Enemies, and we're going to be continuing our series on conflicts of the 20th century and the strategy. We're getting to the end of the 20th century, and of course, it's the end of the Cold War. We sort of left off there. I should explain the changes in Eastern Europe, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the overthrow of Nicolae Ceausescu, the transition of Poland to a democracy with free elections, and Hungary, and so on. This is not what it appeared to be, and I will quote from sources. People can look it up. In Romania, for example, where the most violent changes occurred, Nicolae Ceausescu was overthrown in a kind of coup. Supposedly, the people rose up, and there was supposedly fighting and so on. It started with a sort of incident in Transylvania. And of course, Andrei Codrescu was the first American, a former Romanian who defected to working for, I think it was National Public Radio, I think he was working for. He went back into Romania when the revolution against Ceausescu was underway, and he sort of discovered the truth in his book, The Hole in the Flag. And what he discovered, he met a Russian journalist in Transylvania, in this small town where it all started. And this Russian journalist, at night, they started drinking, and he confessed that, many days before the whole thing started, all these journalists from TASS were ordered from Moscow into Transylvania. And he said, well, what, did you know something was going to happen here before it happened? And the Russian journalist, the Soviet journalist, winked at him. And he said, you mean your country overthrew Ceausescu? And he winks again. And of course, it turns out people in Romania started becoming suspicious when the gunfire that supposedly fired into crowds by Ceausescu's regime was found to be just on loudspeakers. And of course, Ceausescu's own investigation showed that the people that overthrew Ceausescu were Romanian generals who were known to be agents of Moscow. And wow. So the revolution in Romania was from agents in Moscow. The same thing we find Robert Bukar's documentary on the Velvet Revolution and his book, Reality Be Damned. He interviewed former STB agents that got the orders from Moscow to start the Velvet Revolution, which is amazing. And of course, the Berlin Wall, it came down prematurely, but they were planning the next day to start to issue passports and to allow it to happen. This was part of a plan. The communists were doing it. The thing that Fighting Solidarity leaders told me in the early 90s was that Lech Walesa was an agent, codenamed Bolik, of the secret police, and it was well known by the actual resistance to communism in Poland that he was an agent of the regime, and that the communists had been told to infiltrate, to just join Solidarity en masse. So they had to set up Fighting Solidarity to distinguish themselves, the real anti-communists, from the compromised Solidarity. And then, of course, I don't know as much about Hungary, but in Hungary and Bulgaria, they were unlustrated. The communists continued. You had in 2001 the admission that the prime minister of Hungary was not just an agent of the secret police, he was an officer of the secret police who had somehow hidden this, that he had been an actual, Hungarian KGB officer. So you had all these, and then in Germany, the final straw, and this is a little piece, everybody ignored it, about Erich Honecker, the dictator of East Germany, who was the only of all these dictators to be put on trial, except for Ceausescu, who was tried sort of in a funny way in front of these generals and then shot when he and his wife supposedly tried to run away. Erich Honecker's trial was sort of canceled. He had cancer, but the little detail, they excused the trial because of his health, but the real detail that everyone missed was that the prosecutor said, we have no confidence that this man in the courtroom is the real Erich Honecker. Wow. We think he may be a double.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, but I mean, there were so many things going on at the same time, and it's so rare to have an expert like you who is into all these pieces that were being moved around. Now, as you said, you know about this aspect, you know about that aspect. Maybe you're not as deep into this aspect over there, or you haven't
absolutely
you've touched upon this aspect maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago. You may have to refreshen up your stuff, but I mean, it's incredible how many things you know about this. I mean, I'm trying my hardest, but the more you know, the more you are aware, okay, I'm thin here, I'm, almost empty maybe in this aspect over there. So this is something that people in the audience should remember. It's really rare to have an expert like yourself. And
well, it's hard to follow all of this because we're relying on a press that was filtering out a lot of details. There were stories about, coming out of Romania, coming out of Hungary, coming out of these East European countries, coming out of the Soviet Union, the same old faces, right?
Yeah.
That there's no real change in some of these countries. And you had Solzhenitsyn, when he first returned to the Soviet Union after the Soviet Union fell, which we'll get to when you get to late 91, early 92, Solzhenitsyn said, "You are the same old faces, and I see no repentance in you."
Yeah, and people were so focused on the wall coming down, the images on television, the Cold War being supposedly over, no more threat, supposedly, of a nuclear war, everybody just party, and now the world is going to change. So people were focused on these iconic few images and kind of these generalities, but there were so many pieces that were being moved by the Russians at the same time, so people stopped caring, or they may have been following one or two things, but not 20 things, 30 things.
Yeah, and I should say what a KGB officer told me, a disgruntled KGB officer told me, who was involved in all this, and he worked in Vienna, and he said that when they watched the revolution in Russia unfolding, when the statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky at Dzerzhinsky Square was lowered carefully down by cranes and removed, he said, we knew that it was under control, that it was coming from the top, because if it had been a spontaneous thing, they would have smashed that statue to bits, and they didn't. And he said, so we knew that it wasn't all bad, but they saw many bad things happening. Many things that were supposed to happen in Germany and other countries didn't happen. Things went awry in places, even though there was this effort to control everything. And so when he was recalled to see Leonid Shevarshin, who was then the head of the first chief directorate and became the head of the KGB. I think he might have been the last one before they changed its name. And he said, "Look at what's going on. We've lost, haven't we?" And he said, "Well, we've suffered some setbacks. This is an admission from a KGB leader. We've suffered setbacks, but really, we've achieved a lot of things. We have fooled the West. We have." And then his next question to him was about the banks in Austria. How many of those banks did they really have confidence they controlled, and could they move Communist Party money and KGB money through those banks to acquire companies and positions in the West?
Because the KGB had studied the Western system for a long time, right? They had these experts, specialists. They know how to set up companies or shell companies and trusts and, holdings and all that stuff in these tax havens, and move money around and hide true ownership. So they've been planning this for a long time, and so they had ample time to get the pieces moving once the supposed change happened. And
and Germany, Austria, and Italy seem to be key countries to moving, especially Italy with the mafia, was a key country for moving Russian mafia money through, and using as a place for subversion there. And of course, in Germany, they had their positions in East Germany, and of course, Austria was a big one because Austria had been part of the Third Reich and had this partition where the Soviets really had a dominant position in places like Vienna. And so if people don't understand how how much Soviet influence was in Vienna, as in East Germany. So these are the key points. And of course, when later people like Alexander Litvinenko went to defect, like which Western country do I defect to, when the CIA refused to take him, they said, don't go to Italy or Germany, right? Don't go there. Go to the UK, but stay away from those countries. And that's the reason why.
Now, obviously, when the wall came down, the Russians had so much dirt on Western politicians, mainly, business leaders and so on. So there was so much dirt, and especially with the reunified Germany, you saw some sort of a deal, whereas most Stasi people, most politicians from former East, most people would not be prosecuted. You would forgive them operations and stuff they did to Germans, over there back then. So this was a deal, we don't come after you, you don't come after us, you still have some of the material and the videotapes and stuff in your vaults, you keep it there, and let's be friendly with each other. But what the details are of these dealings is, of course, highly secret, and we just don't know fully in the West how much the Russians truly had, because we don't have a full set of assets and operations of the former Stasi. Now, the Stasi was not just, working inside of East Germany and working against Western Germany. The Stasi was all over the place. The Stasi was in Africa. The Stasi was in the Middle East, everywhere. So we don't have a full set of their assets, agents. We don't have a full set of their operations. We just got some, digital database that was just a test database for a system migration. We don't know how much they have.
And we don't know how much false information might have been put into things that were captured.
Oh, yeah.
And that's one of the problems with the things that were captured. For example, the big list that was pilfered in Czechoslovakia of secret police, of STB agents. In fact, I have a copy of the list of all the STB agents in Czechoslovakia. It's a computer file. It's massive, by the way. Yeah. It is like a telephone directory of people. I mean, it is literally. But the thing is you don't know if they tampered with it. They took out names that were important and they put in innocent people, because it's a computer record that could have, since they knew the changes were happening more than a year in advance, because we know this because Moscow called for key files to be removed from all the East Bloc countries about a year before, more than a year, I think it was a year and a half before, I think it was April of 1988, that they started recalling all the records, the key files from the secret police of the Warsaw Pact countries so that they would be housed in the Soviet Union. And of course, this was an indication that they were going to let go or loosen their hold on these countries as part of their plan. But the interesting thing is that Moscow still, in order to, when they carried out this plan of letting go of the Warsaw Pact alliance and hoping that NATO would reciprocate by dissolving, they did something that I think is misunderstood. They caused a war in the Middle East. And let me explain. Everybody says Saddam Hussein attacked Kuwait because of his oil dispute with Kuwait. And that
money,
the American oil companies...
because he didn't want to pay back the money that he owed.
Right. He'd won the war against Iran. The Iran-Iraq war, the Iranians gave up and gave him territory and gave him a bunch of things. But he had this debt. He had these payment problems from the war. And of course, it's true, objectively true, that the Kuwaitis were drilling at an angle to suck up oil out of Iraq, right? I mean, it's true. And the Iraqis had a legitimate complaint about that. And of course, he went to American Ambassador Gillespie and said, what can I do about it? Can I invade, Iraq? Or evade Kuwait. And of course, she apparently made some kind of ambiguous remark about, we don't care to be involved.
We don't have an official position as of now. We're
right.
not going to show you what we think.
And this is when George H.W. Bush and of course the Bush administration, famously being part of that larger Dulles corrupt circle, we don't really understand it entirely, but it was connected. Some people have connected it to the oil companies, and the oil companies were like, they didn't care either. As long as the oil was pumped out of the ground, The oil companies didn't care. But of course, I don't think this is the reason for the war, because Saddam had the dispute, and I think Moscow knew it, but Moscow was pushing from behind.
And of course, because just a short interjection here, Saddam had a significant army. I mean, we're talking about what was it, the world's fourth largest army, almost 1 million standing soldiers, couple of 100,000 paramilitary forces, 4,500 tanks, 500-ish combat aircraft, and 200 helicopters. So this was a significant force.
Yeah, I mean, Iraq was at war for a decade. From 1979, what was it, December 79, when he invaded Iran, or I think maybe it was in 1980 he invaded. I'm forgetting the exact date, but it was, his peace with them was 1989, I think. And so it was like a whole decade that Iraq was at war with Iran, and Iraq was the smaller country, smaller population. Iran has about twice the population of Iraq, if I recall correctly. It's quite significant, and of course Iran was disorganized by the revolution of the mullahs. It was not as able to fight. It had an American-equipped military without access to American, supplies. So it was a very serious problem. And of course, Saddam Hussein, we should explain, Saddam Hussein, along with Iraq, along with Syria and Iraq were considered during the Cold War the extended Warsaw Pact. They were considered integral to the Soviet military system. And I'll explain how this began. Saddam Hussein, before he was president of Iraq, was the interior minister of Iraq. That means he was in charge of the secret police. He went to Moscow in 1973 and he negotiated a treaty, a police-to-police treaty with Yuri Andropov. And this is recorded in the very famous book on Republic of Fear, which is a very famous book that used the methodology of Hannah Arendt to analyze Saddam Hussein's regime. And he documents in there this treaty that was signed between Saddam Hussein and Yuri Andropov, in which the secret police and the interior troops of Iraq would be trained by the Soviet Union, by the KGB. So that means all the leaders of the Iranian secret police would go to Russia, to go to the Soviet Union. And that would mean, of course, the natural process here is that the Soviets would, in fact, recruit these leaders to come back to Iraq to be Soviet agents, basically, in Iraq to maintain the regime. And, of course, this goes throughout all the Iraqi system. Then the Iraqi military follows, to be given Soviet weapons, to be trained by Soviet advisors, and to be given Scud missiles. And actually, it was Soviet military advisors aiming Saddam's Scud missiles during the first Gulf War. It was Soviet military advisors holding those tank divisions together, those armies of Saddam Hussein. So Saddam Hussein could not have gone to war against Kuwait without the Soviets saying, yeah, we'll support you, no problem. So here you have Gorbachev being nice to the West, the Berlin Wall coming down, and all of a sudden there's a war in the Middle East that causes NATO to move the American tanks and key divisions, and the British as well, out of Europe into the Middle East, into Saudi Arabia, to fight the first Gulf War. So that the pressure, as the Soviet armies in East Germany are disintegrating, because that transition to East Germany came too soon, the Soviets had the perfect diversion, which is they will use again and again, all the way up to last October 7th with the Hamas attack, which was, even I just heard Rabin Hassan Yusuf's speech at the UN. He's the son of one of the Hamas founders, and he said it was a birthday gift to Putin on October 7th that they attacked. It was. He said, I can't say more, because he has inside, he's an intimate person. Yeah. He grew up with the leaders of Hamas as his family.
For a long time, this is exactly the point, because for a long time in the Cold War, the policy was Europe first. Europe is more important than the Middle East. There were major operations in the Middle East, but the focus was on Europe. But then it shifted. You couldn't do something super outrageous in Europe, so what's left? The Middle East.
Yeah, and of course, this provocation, Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait was the classic provocation, Soviet style, to cause all the attention in London and Washington especially to shift to the Persian Gulf, because now the Persian Gulf oil was threatened. Saddam Hussein had apparently a threatening phone interchange with the Saudi leadership, basically threatening them. Saddam felt that he had been fighting Iran on behalf of the Arab oil states and that they owed him, right? This was sort of it, and so it was more than just a dispute over the over Kuwait sideways drilling under his oil fields. It was more than that. I mean, there was a just claim, but Saddam had a much larger claim. He was now taking the role of Nasser before, who had claimed to be the leader of the Arab world, and Saddam had fought this war for a decade against Iran, and they all owed him. All the Arab world, especially the Arab oil magnates who owed their security to him. Well, this was basically crossing the Americans, because Kuwait was protected by America, like Saudi Arabia was, to threaten Saudi Arabia, to try to point tank divisions at Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and to say, stick them up, you got to give me oil money. This was stepping on America's toes. And of course, this was perfectly calibrated so that as the Soviet army was disintegrating, as the Soviet Union stubbed its toe in trying to perform this liberalization and to loosen up its control of the Warsaw Pact countries, when this started going awry for them, they needed this diversion. So Saddam provided it. And of course, Saddam, I think, might have realized he was captive to the Soviets, that he was surrounded by Soviet agents, that they controlled his secret police. He could not break free. I don't think he could ever. So he was locked in. And so I think he did this because, well, look, you're going to be a great man. You're going to take over all these places. You're going to be important. And of course, that fed his ego. And of course, the Gulf War began. President George H.W. Bush said this occupation of Kuwait will not stand. And of course, this started, what was it, Operation Desert Shield, where we were going to come in to make sure he didn't advance into the Saudi oil fields, which, by the way, his massive army was right on top of those oil fields. And he did not. And of course, the war ended up being a massive air assault on Iraq that denuded him, broke up his army. When his army finally fled Kuwait on the highway of death, our air forces destroyed the many elements in the fleeing army, and his regime was almost overthrown. But when various groups rebelled against Saddam, we did not intervene. We allowed Saddam to crush them, which was probably a mistake given what happened later. But George H.W. Bush did not want a wider war. His son did that, and we saw the horrible expense and cost of that war in American lives and wounded, especially American wounded. And of course, George H.W. Bush was more prudent. Prudent was his middle name. Yeah. And they imposed a peace. By the way, they imposed a peace agreement on Saddam. They froze the conflict and said, all right, you're going to open up to weapons inspections. We want to make sure you're not building chemical and biological and nuclear weapons, and so on. But Saddam played games with this. He kept, over the years, he would comply and then he wouldn't. But that was sort of the Gulf War. And of course, Kuwait was liberated.
And it's a big difference between liberating Kuwait and, defeating Saddam's army. This is a big difference from what we saw in Germany after World War II, because you had all these you had the occupation, then you had the rebuilding phase, and there was some common ground. You could talk to the Germans and start to work with them and build up these structures, because it was a Western country, to some degree, of course. So there was the option of rebuilding Germany. This was not the same with Saddam's Iraq. I mean, there were some possibilities and some options, but this is a whole nother ballgame over there.
Yeah, now I understand, if I'm remembering, you can correct me, that Helmut Kohl gave the Soviet Union something like 80 billion Deutschmarks as a kind of payment And as I recall, as soon as it reached the Soviet Union,
some debt was, declared
right,
null and void.
right, exactly. Germany had this financial card. Of course, the Soviet Union, because of the failure of the changes, the things they were trying, the experiments they were trying, they needed the money quite a bit, and so they took the money to run with. But the funny thing is when when there was questions in Washington about, well, what are you going to do with that money? It was like, well, we don't know where the money is. We don't know. The money, as soon as it was delivered from Germany, it disappeared. Of course, the United States didn't want to give any money to the Soviet Union. And of course, Germany was careful in the future what they were going to give them. But it was like Russia was this black hole in which there was no accountability for anything given. And of course, it was going straight to the KGB and the Communist Party, and they were probably turning that money around and going out and buying positions in the West.
There was some American aid, of course, American aid to secure the vast nuclear arsenal of the Soviet Union. For example, in November of 1991, the U.S. Congress allocated $400 million. This came out of the defense budget, to secure Soviet nuclear weapons. But even then, when you gave them money, they secured a lot of their nuclear warheads with just some guy standing in front of a building.
Well, their nuclear
fences.
warheads were secure because they were in Soviet military bases. But the interesting thing about this idea of securing the warheads, what's interesting, a lot of this is just propaganda. And my friend Peter Pry, the late Peter Pry, told me this. He said that $400 million was to go to a facility that the Soviets would build, and then later the Russians continued to build, that would be used to disassemble Soviet nuclear warheads, right?
Yeah.
To take them apart. And and even the New York Times admitted this, 14 years later. There had been no accountability for this. And I asked Peter around the year 2000, I said, well, what about this 400 million? And he said, well, the Soviets kept saying, we're building the facility to pull apart the warheads, to disarm, to do nuclear disarmament. And then finally they went into cost overruns. I think it went over $1 billion we ended up giving them for this facility. And what they did is they actually built a new nuclear weapons manufacturing facility. Because what Peter told me was, he said, well, a plant that can take apart nuclear weapons can put them together. Right? So it's the same thing. Anything you build that can disassemble a nuclear weapon can assemble them.
And also, obviously, they pulled the warheads from Ukraine that was stationed there, of course, very much in the interest of Russia.
Well, that came in 1994. That was later.
And of course, they closed down, the Russians, they closed down some of these biological weapons facilities. And you may know roughly the year of these defectors like Pasechnik and Ken Alibek or Alibekov.
Alibekov came later in the Cold War. Pasechnik came earlier. His testimony before Congress is fascinating to read because he's just spilling the beans about all the horrific things they're making. They manufactured more than 100 tons of smallpox. They would freeze it. They would freeze this stuff.
Full of this stuff in a warehouse.
And then they would make them. They had to make them into spores. Smallpox, anthrax, and bubonic plague. They had 100. It was like 100 tons of freeze-dried biological material. And they would make it. You had to make the particles, I think, 5 microns in diameter. I think was the size you needed to make them, because if they were too small, you'd breathe them in and then you'd breathe them out again. If they were too heavy, they would get stuck in the mouth or they wouldn't reach the lung. So they had to make these things. And of course, they were made to be put in hoses of Soviet aircraft to seed cold air masses. And this was they called it a polar outbreak attack, where they could actually infect tens of millions of Americans with one attack, with any of these biological weapons. And it's ideal to be used in the winter, not the summer, because hot sunlight degrades dry biological material. But this is the way to spread. This is the Soviet way of biological war, opposed to using viruses, contagious viruses, which is the Chinese method.
And these defectors, they of course explain that the program was much bigger than previously thought in the West. So it was possible for the Russians to close down some facilities and invite these American, inspectors, or whatever you want to call them, because some of these facilities were then converted into civilian facilities, but the bulk of the program, or parts of the program, that was in Russia then. So they moved bits to Russia.
This was, right, exactly. This is a way of leeching American money. Again, American administrators went over to take over these labs and to pay these scientists to do other research. And of course, their fear was if they just closed the labs and the scientists went away, the scientists would go work for North Korea or Iran or Iraq. And they didn't want this to happen. So we wanted to support these Russian scientists in doing other work. And of course, there's been allegations from people like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. that they were doing some of this dangerous biological work that Mr. Fauci was supporting in China of, basically making dangerous viruses able to jump from animals onto humans, like the bat virus that caused the COVID-19 pandemic. But it was all meant to be done in a way that would prevent biological warfare from being extenuated. And of course, the problem was, of course, you had American administrators. This is my worry about it. You had American administrators going to the former Soviet Union, living there to administer this. And of course, what are they exposed to in terms of blackmail, recruitment? The Russians just love it when you're living on their soil. They can monitor you 24/7 and look at your weaknesses. Are your weaknesses for sex? Are you a pervert? Do you have weaknesses for money? Do you have a giant ego that can be fed? How can they recruit you? So I don't know that anyone was recruited, but this is an opening in our own biological defenses, because many of the people that went over there to manage their biological program, when we basically took it over and tried to keep those scientists from going to North Korea and Iraq, many of those scientists were from our programs that would defend, from our CDC and from our National Institutes of Health and so on, that would be defending us against Fauci's agency and so on.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you should mention this real quick here. When the Gulf War, when the Gulf War happened, I think this was the first Gulf War. There was an anthrax risk, that Saddam may actually use anthrax, and the calculations were you needed X amount of pounds, and we were just talking pounds of powderized anthrax spores. You need a device to make them airborne, to create these clouds, and then you could saturate the American bases with it and kill 100,000, 200,000 people.
Yeah, so the thing about anthrax, this milling of the biological material to the 5 microns is not easy to do. Not just any lab or civilian can do this. Right. This is why some of these anthrax attacks were not effective, because probably somebody who didn't understand how it worked tried to do it at home or something. I don't know, on a regular lab. But there is evidence that Saddam Hussein had, and we should mention red mercury while we're at it, because I knew Sam Cohen, and who was the inventor of the neutron bomb and had worked on the Manhattan Project, and he was very strong in saying that the Soviets had developed, he believed, by the time you get to the end of the Soviet Union, they had developed red mercury, a red mercury fusion device. Now, what is red mercury? Red mercury was naturally the next stage in the development of nuclear weapons. Red mercury, just to explain, you had the atomic bomb, which was compared to the hydrogen bomb a firecracker that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then in the 1950s, when the hydrogen bomb was developed, the hydrogen bomb operates with a atom bomb as a trigger. So inside every hydrogen bomb is a little atom bomb that is actually triggers the hydrogen.
It's a bomb within a bomb, right?
Right. It creates the implosion basically that can cause a hydrogen reaction and activate the tritium, which is a hydrogen gas that is used in the hydrogen bomb that makes such a tremendous blast. And but here's what red mercury is. Red mercury is a compound, an organic compound, a chemical compound that can directly cause an implosion sufficient to trigger the tritium, to trigger the hydrogen reaction, to cause the hydrogen fusion explosion. Because a hydrogen bomb is fusion, atomic bomb is fission, and fusion is not only clean burning, there's no long-term fallout or very little long-term fallout, very, very residual long-term fallout from a hydrogen bomb, but there's the fact of not needing that atomic trigger miniaturizes the hydrogen bomb so that you can have a hydrogen bomb the size of a softball, right? Boy. That's maybe 5 to 10 kilotons, not a huge bomb, but you could make larger bombs on this scale too. But it's ideal for really small. Imagine a handheld 10 kiloton bomb. It's not quite as big as the Hiroshima bomb, but it's pretty darn big. It could knock down a city block, right?
In the Gulf War, when anthrax became an issue, the Americans tried to come up with this a scheme to make an anthrax vaccine, but this ran into many problems because if you have facilities and you use them for an anthrax vaccine, you cannot use them for anything else. And what happens if the Iraqis have a different version of anthrax, then the vaccine doesn't work. So this was a problem back then, and this came back later again, shortly after 9/11, with the anthrax letters that were mailed to people. This is when billions of dollars were allocated for biodefense, but it didn't go to the U.S. Emirate, the military. It went to the NIH, which meant Fauci back then.
Yeah, one point, we also had the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. Going into this biological warfare, the whole war against AIDS and Fauci's role in it is extremely significant because they latched on to the HIV as a cause of AIDS, and that may be the case. It was disputed. People like Peter Duesberg said, no, it's more complicated than that. He was one of the discoverers of retroviruses. There were others. There was a Dr. Jane, I think her name was Jane Tees, who said, look, this is African swine fever that's causing this. It is not the HIV. And of course, there was a journalist, he was a gay journalist in New York, who investigated this and wrote a series of books, which I think are significant. And I don't know I'm not a biologist, so I don't know what the truth is there. But there is such a problem with science. Back in 1989, you had a lot of fraud in science. And if you go back to 1989, and I almost put this in my book, Origins of the Fourth World War, there was a discussion in Congress about creating an Office of Scientific Integrity because there was so much cheating in government-supported labs in science. They would come up with theories that were completely bogus. They knew they were bogus, and they would falsify the results of their tests to get re-upped on money that was supplied by the government to different programs. And this was a staple. There were just many scientists that were involved in really fake research. And of course, this corruption of science, it was discussed by many people, but the problem that they came to when they looked at it was if they created an Office of Scientific Integrity, who would make sure of their integrity? That office itself would become immediately corrupted by the money that Big Pharma and other groups were getting to do all these studies. And it was impossible for laymen to sort out what was the fake science from the real. And of course, it may have been by that time that more than half of your scientific research was just simply a giant series of boondoggles, right?
Yeah.
And of course, we see this with the AIDS, the controversy over AIDS. I think the whole question is really scientifically opaque to me.
Yeah, and
I studied this.
You can always spend years on a single project and get all this money and then say, well, it didn't work out.
Massive
and this
money.
is common, very common, because so many times out of 100 it fails, so it's all good, and then you can just work and get money.
And you see, the thing is that what you find in the really good journalism, especially by some of the gay journalists who were extremely, obviously, gay people were dying in large numbers of this. They had the greatest concern, but the kind of political pressures and the kind of incestuous financial dealings between big pharma. I mean, some of these guys were noticing this and saying, wait a minute, big pharma is going to make a lot of money. And Fauci wanted an AIDS vaccine that everyone would have to take, which was really scary. And people were saying, this is scary and dangerous. Don't do this. So he was blocked from this vaccine. Of course, he had this crazy dream of a universal flu vaccine. Everybody gets it and nobody ever gets the flu again, right? This kind of thing. Well, we know that vaccines are inherently dangerous, and you want to have vaccines from like tetanus. There are certain things you probably need vaccines for, but you don't want to give too many. And there's this question of autism in children, and I don't know. Again, the science is opaque. When people think science is an easy thing, but scientists don't even agree.
Especially if people start reading into this, and I recommend that. People should get books on spillovers, naturally occurring diseases, then biological warfare. There's some really good books out there, serious books on biological warfare, the Russian programs, other programs. People should read into this, and then you realize that these authors who are really experts and they've spent time in Africa and they've done the whole thing, they've been in hot zones, you realize they have to dumb it down for you as a reader. And it's still, difficult to comprehend, because the more you get into this, the more complex it becomes. It's really, really intricate.
Well, one of the things I discovered about viruses, and it goes back to Salk and to the all the way back to the original discoverer of them, and it was through vaccinating chickens. They accidentally discovered the immunity that could be given by giving injections to people of a little bit of a disease or some part of a disease, so the immune system could adjust. But of course, the reality is viruses are very strange microorganisms that are not fully understood. They're almost like there's even a debate about are they living beings, or are they like robots? They're almost like nanotechnology.
And they're
almost like God's little nanobots,
And they're difficult to see, because when you look at these things under a super microscope, it's really hard to tell what is what, and hard to see. So many images you see in the media are, of course, digitally enhanced, or they're digital recreations. And so some people, of course, they go all over the place and they say that you need a perfect image of this virus and totally clean, nothing else being there. Of course, it's difficult to get a perfect image. But it's just this complexity, and sometimes you just have to test and experiment and then say, well, this thing has specific attributes and this is what we have to work with, right?
Yeah, there's mysteries about the actions of viruses, and this is where what it comes in the disagreement between people like Peter Duesberg and the mainstream, a lot of the other scientists. In the scientific debate, and of course, not being a virologist myself, you have to realize that every science has limitations in what they know. And they have theories and educated guesses, and those educated guesses, often years later, we discover, okay, we didn't understand this, that was wrong. We were partly right, but we were partly wrong. And this is how science advances. And so one must never regard these scientific statements, because there is no consensus in science. Science doesn't work by consensus. It's actually quite the opposite. Science works by a guy coming who who goes against the consensus and says, wait a minute, we've been wrong about this all along. Because otherwise, if we were right about everything all along, we would have never needed to advance, right? So there would be no advances. So it is, somebody has to be willing to go up against the so-called consensus. So science is not about consensus. So we've got this, and the same thing with global warming and the question about it's not. We know the planet gotten warmer.
This was also a big thing of the 90s. When in 1999, when the big hockey stick study came out, and the computer models were pretty poor at the time, but they already said that this is it. We've reconstructed the past with proxy data. We didn't really have much CO2 emissions, and then when the industrial age began, suddenly it skyrocketed, blah, blah, blah. So this was even in the 90s, and so this study was considered a breakthrough and gold standard and whatever, and then they kept building on top of this. So this was also a big thing in the 90s.
Yeah. When you look at philosophy of science, one of the problems is the confusion of cause and effect. Does the CO2 come after the warming or before? And of course, a lot of the tree ring data suggests that CO2 levels increase after warming, because CO2 is produced in the atmosphere naturally by plants and animals and so on. So there's these complex problems, and you've got people like the famous Danish, I'm not remembering him, famous Danish scientist who discovered the mechanism that might be the mechanism of the ice ages, which is the mechanism of global cooling, which is the sun's electromagnetic field diminishing and causing more cosmic rays to come into the Earth's atmosphere and strike the oceans, creating more clouds. Yeah. And clouds reflect sunlight, as well as, a cloudy day is cooler than a sunny day. And then you have more rain and precipitation, you have more snowfall and more cold. And of course, this is probably the mechanism of the ice ages, or part of it.
Yeah, and obviously,
but he's been attacked by the global warming people because they don't think the sun has anything to do with global warming, right? Yeah, when the sun is where all the heat really comes from.
If anything changes in space, slight changes, and there's more energy coming in, this slight bit of more energy that hits us is more significant than what we do with our industrial capabilities. And also, obviously, the West has the leading, or even back then in the 90s, the West had the leading research and technology when it came to weather science and climate science. And I always say to people, when it's a regular topic, you just say, look at the science, read into it, and try to figure out what it means, because it's not final. But when you're talking about other topics, then you have an intermingling of military concerns and even espionage, even enemy espionage, and just weird stuff going on. So this is when you can't just look at that piece of science. You have to consider the espionage and the scheming, right, that may contaminate the science. And when it comes to climate science, I looked at this very closely. It was built for a long time for the military, because this is how, the D-Day landing in Normandy happened, because of a very precise weather forecast by the British, and they had to steal and fight for every bit of weather data to make that accurate prediction, to make that landing happen. So it was built mostly by the military for military purposes, and they can get to a certain degree of precision, not perfect precision you would need for a soft piece of software that predicts the future. But what then happened in the 90s was that you saw the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And what happened with all this data that came from America mostly, NASA, all the satellites, NOAA, and other places, and of course the British had the UK Met Office, which for a long time was attached to the military. Suddenly all this data was then shipped to this place in Britain. I think it was the Hadley Center. And there they had this fancy computer, which is actually an American computer, and they made this piece of software that supposedly predicts the future. So you cannot fault all these great people working at NASA, great people working at NOAA. You can't fault them for what these British do at the Hadley Center with their funky bit of software. right? So they claim over there they can take all this data from various areas of climate science and they put this stuff together in a perfect way, they basically claim indirectly, and then they translate everything perfectly into computer code. And this is how they say they can predict the future 50 years ahead, 100 years ahead in connection with the CO2 we're emitting. So it's not like every person at NOAA or NASA or every climate scientist is part of some conspiracy. But what happens with these weird British, and we know how the British were compromised by the Russians for a long time. It's what they do over there. And the guy who was running the IPCC reports, I think the first 3 reports, Sir John Theodore Houghton, he also is responsible for the Hadley Center and the software they use. Other countries have software too, but it's way worse than what the British have. And so we supposedly have to rely on that computer program. And this is then considered the final answer. And we have to change our lives and everything because the software says so.
Well, and see, software, people think that a computer model is gospel, but it's not. It's only as good as its assumptions. If I have the assumption that CO2 is warming the atmosphere and I put that in my model, then I'm going to get the answer that I want, and it's like big pharma. Creating all these medicines that may be worse than they mask symptoms. They don't necessarily cure disease. And so you have this problem in the whole global warming thing that when you go back, it appears to be a weapon invented in the Soviet Union. You go back to the editor of Pravda, who became a Politburo member in Gorbachev's last Politburo, who actually wrote a book which is translated into English and German. And it was one of my German readers that pointed it out to me, in which he talked about, this book came out in 1982, was it? This book talked about using the greenhouse gas theory to basically limit energy in the West. To basically, this is the beginning. So the idea of capping our energy usage started in the Soviet think tank, started and was first proposed by the editor of Pravda. So it's a Soviet and by the way, with nuclear winter theory, that came from Andropov. We know this from Sergei Tretyakov, the KGB defector. Who said, look, this was a scam, this nuclear winter stuff, all the science and the models. Remember TTAPS, where Carl Sagan proposed this, they did these TTAP study. They used models, right, to prove that a nuclear war would cause nuclear winter. Well, there was no proof there. And in fact, not only did Sergei Tretyakov say that this was a scam, one of the Russian scientists, one of the Soviet scientists involved in this, actually went to American authorities and said, this is a scam. We were put up to this by the KGB. And he was then kidnapped at a conference in Spain in 1985 and never seen or heard from again. But it's important. If you look at this, the models, the math for nuclear winter and the models comes from the math for nuclear winter is the same math used in global warming. Yeah. So the global warming science is based on the same math which we know the KGB created and it had these guys falsify.
And if you have any sort of mathematical equation, right? This is when, your daughter, your son is in school and they start working on these equations, or maybe this long, several different factors and what is X and so on. If you make one little mistake, the result is wrong and it can be off by a lot, right? So when the calculation becomes longer and longer, you can make more mistakes and still every single mistake screws up the final result. Now, when you talk about simulating the Earth and try to estimate the clouds and the oceans and the energy and everything, when you try to calculate that, you not just have an incredibly long calculation. It's hilariously long. It's basically three-dimensional. Imagine a three-dimensional or multi-dimensional mathematical equation or computer code. You make mistakes. The result is way off. And also, if you look at the individual pieces of climate science, because I did that. I looked up leading scientists current scientists working on different bits, the clouds, the oceans, the satellites measuring things. I looked at all these different fields and I looked for studies that talked about problems or challenges. So I wanted to know how precise is this field and that field and that field. And they can say, we can do crazy things. We can measure an iceberg pretty precisely. We can also measure the size of a Russian installation or a Russian ship. But it's just that precise. We cannot make it more precise. So you see this in all these fields. They say we can do things up to that degree, but not further. So you don't have perfection in all of these fields. But what happens if you don't have perfections in any field? You combine this to a whole meta field. Of course it can't be accurate. It's impossible to do. And I read that book by Bill Gates. He has a climate book, which is actually an investment book, right? So this guy says in the book, here's what you need for a powerful economy, for a powerful state. You need fuel, you need steel, you need, obviously you need concrete, artificial fertilizer, stuff that is easy to produce, right, with conventional methods that emit CO2. But you can also make these things, he says, climate neutral, carbon neutral, but this way, it's hilariously complicated. You need all these investments and you need all these new patents that he wants to own and his friends wanted to own. And so then, in his estimation, the traditional methods of making these products, the traditional methods will be outlawed, so only the new methods will be allowed, controlled by him and his buddies, right? I mean, this is kind of the investment book he wrote, where he says that, well, dear reader, look at these new corporations that I finance and my friends like Warren Buffett, like they finance it. If you buy shares in these companies, this may go through the roof. So it's not a climate book, really. It's an investment book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So anyway, getting back to what the Russians and Chinese, of course, during this entire period, China is being invested in and China is being built up by the West, and Russia has got its hand out to be built up. And of course, we talked about the biological warfare scam, the nuclear warhead scam. Later, I was going to say even the New York Times admitted there had never been an accounting for the destruction of warheads. Bill Lee, who wrote the ABM Treaty charade, pointed out that the Russians had violated the ABM Treaty by building a dual-purpose surface-to-air missile, SAM ABM system that we had not counted as an ABM system, in which they used nuclear weapons. They had several thousand nuclear weapons as warheads on their SAMs, so they could send a nuclear weapon up into the atmosphere to destroy incoming warheads. This was the Soviet method of fighting incoming American warheads, and it was a question of they could really destroy a lot of our warheads coming in during the Cold War. And Lee said there was never an accounting for those nuclear warheads that were part of the Russian air defense system, their ABM system. So there was all this Russian cheating that continued past the end of the Cold War. There was no real accounting of the Russian nuclear warheads, and Russia continued to maintain its nuclear arsenal as the United States didn't. And what happened when the Soviet Union, we finally get to 1991 and the August coup, which was as phony as a $2 bill, and you've got people like Yevgeny Albats.
The communists trying to take back power and whatnot.
Yeah, right. Many people have pointed to the inconsistencies. We don't know what this was. We don't understand what happened. Gorbachev supposedly went on a vacation, ended up isolated or under house arrest. You had Yaniev, the vice president of the Soviet Union, in charge of this coup group, this group of conservatives, quote unquote, who were going to take back control. And then you had the suicide of Marshal Orgarkov and others, and you had there was blood spilled. There was something, there was, again, a reckoning by the KGB against the military, which we'd seen going on throughout the later 80s with generals dying in helicopter crashes and being, purged for the Matthias Rust airplane landing in Moscow. This German kid flies a small plane to Red Square right through the Russian-Soviet air defenses. So you had all these there was a struggle, and I think there has been scholarly work done. I've got some of it here on how the KGB and the party became, after Able Archer, after the almost nuclear war, they became a little leery of the Soviet generals, and they started purging the smarter ones, bringing, ones that weren't as bright, were maybe more corrupt, more flexible to what the KGB and party wanted into the military system. So there was a lowering of the standards in the Soviet military and then the Russian military, no doubt about it. But they were maintaining those nuclear weapons, and they were thinking the West was going to give them what they wanted. And it was Boris Yeltsin, and we see it in black and white, in the last meeting between Boris Yeltsin and Bill Clinton in Ankara, Turkey, on November 19th, 1999, where Boris Yeltsin chastises chastises Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton says, "Look, I'm doing what you want. I'm defending the ABM treaty. I'm not giving it up." Which the Russians are cheating on, of course. And Boris Yeltsin basically says, Bill, I believe in you. I still believe in you. But we ask one thing: give Europe to Russia. And this is not Putin asking this. This is Boris Yeltsin. And he's talking about the one common European home that Gorbachev kept underscoring in his writings and speeches. And Boris Yeltsin talked about the one common European home. At one point, he included Canada in this.
Eurasia.
Yes. And I should note that while this is going on, while Russia's trying to get control over Canada and Europe, on the pretext that now we're good guys, we're on your side, you defend America, these other countries, get out of Europe and let us have Europe. This is actually going on, and pressure is being placed on Bill Clinton, who definitely was a blackmailable figure, but he resisted whatever that pressure was, it seems. Well, he probably couldn't deliver. He said to Boris Yeltsin, I can't give you Europe. They won't go along with it. They don't want to be underneath, right? They don't want to be under Moscow. And even the communists, the former communists in Eastern Europe, many of them probably didn't like the kowtowing to the Russians. So this was a real problem. And of course, what was really going on here was that Russia and China had a series of meetings at the end of the Cold War and at the beginning of the Russian Federation. I knew Colonel Stanislav Lunev. He defected in March of 1992. So I had many conversations with him, and what he was witness to, he was a Mandarin-speaking Chinese GRU colonel who was familiar with their war plans, and he said that when the Soviet Union fell, when that process was going on, the Chinese and Russian leaders were secretly meeting, and they arranged a treaty, not only an intelligence treaty, to share and coordinate their intelligence operations in North America, but they planned a future war against the United States and also Canada, that they had figured out how to divide the spoils. Since Europe was going to Russia, China wanted the lower 48 states. Russia would get Alaska and parts of Canada. And we see billboards in Siberia saying Alaska is ours. The Russians claiming they were only loaning Alaska to us. They didn't sell it to us.
Oh, wait
a
minute.
Yeah.
No, they sold it, right? There was a purchase.
They actually sold it. They did.
Because they couldn't use it. They couldn't really populate it
No.
and make something out of it. They couldn't do it.
They had too much. They had Siberia already. They had too much Arctic land. They didn't need Alaska, and they needed the money. So it was Seward's folly. A lot of Americans thought we paid too much money for Alaska. It wasn't worth it. It was just a wasteland. But the Russians, they'll make up any story, like in Ukraine, to claim territory as theirs. They'll say Ukrainians are Russians. They'll say this territory was stolen from us. It belongs to Moscow. They're saying that about Alaska. And in fact, believe it or not, it was Vladimir Zhirinovsky, the head of the Russian Liberal Democratic Party, a former KGB officer.
Very aggressive.
Very aggressive. He sort of behaved like a fascist, right?
Yeah.
Because in communist lexicon, liberals are fascists, right? Liberal Democrats are fascists. This goes back to the 1930s. So they basically. It was Vladimir Zhirinovsky's party that proposed this legislation. I think it was in the year 2000, to set up to make the legislation to set up a Russian government for Alaska, a provincial government for Alaska. And that legislation, that was 24 years ago, they passed that legislation. So it is on the books. They say Alaska's there. They've passed legislation to govern Alaska from Moscow.
Well, they also want East Germany back.
Well, tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, they also had these things in the Russian parliament, and they have some plans drawn up, and they come up with this argument that the German reunification is not really valid because of this and that, because they had a deal involving, what would happen to Eastern Europe, blah, blah, blah. And so we, the West, we broke that deal. So that basically means they don't care what was decided in the early 1990s. So that's null and void. That means the Russian occupation zone is still active over East Germany and so on and so forth. So they want it back.
So technically, legally, East Germany is still a Russian occupation zone according to law, German law?
No, not according to German law, but that's kind of the funky argument that the Russians are concocting right now, that the decisions that were made back then are not valid. They're null and void. Yeah. They're null and void. So what's left, the old order, they have an occupation here. And so they can restart that occupation somehow. I mean, they can always come up with a stupid argument. We saw that with Ukraine and other places. They will use any legal mumbo jumbo they can think of, and they just want it back.
Yeah, and of course, the whole reason for the deception of Gorbachev's deception of liberalizing the East Bloc was to get control of the whole. It's sort of give up this, get them to trust us, get them to leave, get the Americans to leave Europe, pull their troops out. Well, first they got them to pull the troops to the Middle East. And then they were thinking, well, now that they're out of the Middle East, maybe they won't come back to Europe, right? And of course, the United States downsized its army from 27 divisions to 10 in the 1990s, so that we had only 10 active divisions. And the others were put in a kind of a reserve status. And of course, U.S. Navy began to shrink in the 1990s. And the other thing, and Boris Yeltsin complimented Clinton on this in that November 19th meeting, the United States was disassembled its nuclear weapons manufacturing industry. So our tritium plants, our plants for putting together nuclear weapons, they were all pulled apart. The people were all retired. They were forced to go into other jobs, the engineers, the nuclear physicists, and so on. And I even know one that was training to be a nuclear weapons expert or designer. And their careers they had to go into other areas of physics. They couldn't go into this. There was no money for it. And of course, this was a mistake.
Even many conventional things were scaled down, right? I mean, even smaller rocket engines, these corporations didn't get contracts anymore, so they shut down production lines and plants. And this is a problem now, because now you think you need a specific amount of smaller conventional rockets and missiles, for the future. But to make them, you need the corporations that can make them. And now if you make the decision to build more of the stuff, it has to be started up, and it takes time, and we don't have time.
Yeah. And of course, politically, what happened is that there was a kind of economic dislocation from the fall of the Soviet Union that affected the United States. So the U.S. went into recession in 1992 in the presidential election year. And who comes up to challenge George H.W. Bush for the presidency but William Clinton, the governor of Arkansas, who had been involved in this Iran or in this Contra resupply operation, the Mena, Arkansas thing. Well, according to Terry Reid, was up to his hips in it and was dirty as all get out. But Clinton, more than that, had a background in that when he was a student, he was supporting KGB organized protests in Britain when he was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. Oh, yeah. And he was part of a group of far leftists who were against the Vietnam War at the time. And of course, Clinton was very far to the left. he had communist ideas if you talk to people who knew him back then. And I met Derek Shearer, who's a friend of Bill Clinton's circle, was part of that circle. And I met Derek Shearer in 1980, late 1980, I think it was. He came to speak at UC Irvine when I was an undergraduate. And I got to talk to him. I spent about a half an hour talking to him because there was hardly anybody showed up for his speech. He was writing at the time for Tom Hayden, Jane Fonda's husband, who had written this book on economic democracy. And Shearer had come to UC Irvine to promote economic democracy, and these two friends of mine that I played chess with were Marxists. They dragged me to the meeting. Well, you're a political science guy. You need to hear this.
Yeah.
And so what Derek Shearer was saying was, we need economic democracy, and this is what it is. And I kept thinking, well, that's the same as communism. And so after the talk, I went up on the stage and I said, Mr. Shearer, what's the difference between economic democracy and communism or Marxism? And he looked at the guys I was with to see who this was that was asking him, right? And he said, well, I probably shouldn't say this. These were his exact words. But there is no difference. And so I said, well, then why not just talk about communism and socialism? And he said, well, the C word and the S word.
The Fondas were surveilled in the Cold War, right? Because they were so pro-Soviet, right?
Well, maybe early on, they supported Vietnam, the communist Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese
and they wanted
regime,
to do some big march in D.C., something like that.
Well, he was one of the Chicago Seven. Tom Hayden was one of those arrested that caused the rioting, the communist-inspired far-left rioting at the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968. And of course, they even made a TV a movie or a miniseries out of their trial. I started to watch it, but it was too sickening, too sickeningly soft on communism for my taste. For people, first of all, an ideology that is nothing but a pack of lies, and to take these stupid idiot students who believe in it, to take them as some kind of heroes, is really to invert, good and evil. All these people weren't necessarily evil, but they were certainly misguided, and they were serving an evil cause. Because when you get to Cambodia and Vietnam, the millions who died as a result of losing that war, millions who died at the hands of the communists, that blood is on the hands of everyone who protested the Vietnam War. 68,000 Americans died to keep those people free, and now they died in vain, and millions had to die because you undermined the defense of freedom against the communists. You gave the communists a victory there. It's galling.
I mean,
and that these people celebrate themselves as heroes.
I mean, if it's a scary thought,
they're not heroes.
It's a scary thought if the enemy, if the Soviets are inside your head. They have programmed your mind. They have put things in there to affect your perception, to affect your decision making. And they studied this. They had all these experts and shrinks and neuroscientists and everything. So they install these things in your head. So your entire framework of decision making and action is so limited, and you go into a specific direction. I mean, they are inside your head.
Yeah. And see, one of the communists that tried to recruit me in 1983 and invited me to a communist meeting where the communist speaker said, we are infiltrating the Democratic Party through its left wing to take it over and to elect a stealth communist president. Well, when Bill Clinton, when I went to this lady's office hours to talk about the meeting, she said, she showed me the guy's book. I wish I had gotten a copy of that guy's book because I can't remember the speaker's name. But she said, we have such hopes for this young governor, Bill Clinton, in Arkansas. And so I remembered that. I thought, wow, there's a politician that they think is going to be this future stealth communist president. And there it was in 1992, Bill Clinton is running, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this guy is the guy she was referring to. And he's going to be the Democratic candidate for president in 1992. And of course, with the bad economy, and of course, they did bring up the fact that now when he was a student at Oxford, Bill Clinton had gone to Moscow. In December of 1969, he went to Moscow by himself on a trip paid for by this KGB front organization he worked for in the peace movement. And then after he was in Moscow, and goodness knows what he did there when he was there, he had a schoolmate at Oxford.
I could imagine some of the things he probably maybe did to have fun over there.
Who did he meet with? And of course he had a schoolmate who was from Czechoslovakia, from one of the families that was the founding families of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. So he went to Prague. And again, I've said this, there are stories about what happened with him in Prague. There's papers, there's letters.
What happens in Prague stays in Prague.
Yeah, and the problem is nobody can prove anything. But these questions were actually raised during the election. But because the Cold War was over, because the Soviet Union was no more, this was not considered legitimate, and people said it's McCarthyism. The communism is not a threat anymore. Bill Clinton's past, he should not be reproached with his past. He's obviously a Democratic Party centrist, him and his wife, even though there's more stories about his wife's radical communist leanings. There's even allegations that she secretly traveled to Havana. But I don't know if any of that is true, about Hillary Clinton. But
she also has some occult leanings. Now it's very hard to pin down, and there's all kinds of stuff on the internet. Much of the stuff is wrong, but she has those leanings, and we know that the Russians have used this in other places.
And she was a big, like a protege practically of Saul Alinsky, who wrote Rules for Radicals and dedicated his book to Satan, the first rebel, right?
And also this Rules for Radicals stuff is like something you would also find in psychological warfare to be used all around the world, but you can use the stuff in America, right?
He was Alinsky was not a member of the Communist Party, but he should have been. There's no reason he believed the same thing as they did. So he merely stayed out of the Communist Party to avoid the association, the negative association. And this is where you get the problem. It's people who believe in this that are very dangerous. And when they gain culture power and they get money behind them, and they've gotten a lot of money behind them, you can subvert an entire country. You can subvert a republic. And of course, this is what the Clinton administration was. It was a massive subversion, the Clintons getting power. And you know what the first thing they tried to do when they took power? So Clinton wins the election.
94?
Bill Clinton wins the election in 92.
No, 92.
He becomes president in 93. In January 93, after his inauguration, the first thing he's pushing is gays in the military, which is calculated to demoralize the military. Now, they had to retreat on that and come back later and actually affected it. But in those days, it was too shocking. Nobody would accept it. They had to take a rebuff. And Hillary Clinton was going to be in charge of a lot of this stuff. She was in charge of, by the way, they wanted to do what it became Obamacare. She was going to be the health czar. She was going to be the one to push socialized medicine, basically, for America. And that also the country rejected at the time, thank goodness. But of course, everything the Clintons were trying to do, Obama did later. Succeeded. So it's like, okay, they're not ready for it. We need to do more groundwork at the grassroots, and then come back after the interval.
What was Obama
Bush
doing in the 90s? I mean, all that crazy backstory that people have looked into, and his family and his everything, and the communist mentors that he had, and is this
Frank Marshall Davis?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, Obama has even more suspicious background, and of course,
people don't remember him. People don't remember him at Columbia University, really, and he supposedly had this.
People that make that claim, yes, that they don't remember him at Columbia. That they don't. They had an interview with the lead political science professor that taught the core course curriculum in political science at Columbia, who they asked. This is years ago now. They asked him, "Do you remember this young black student, Barack Obama, in your class?" And he did not. And he said, "You wouldn't miss a young black student like this.
Obama studied constitutional law, right? And he basically
at Harvard. When he went to get his law degree, he went to Harvard, right? Okay. So that was different, but it was. He started out actually. His first year as an undergraduate was at Occidental, which is a
Oh, yeah.
which is a school in California, and of course.
Wait a second. Wait a second. I think that's where a powerful German politician also went to. I think it's our current Minister of the Interior, if I'm not mistaken. But I have to look it up. I did something about that. There was these left-wing professors and everything, and I think it's Nancy Faeser. I think it's our current Minister of the Interior.
Well, there's look. I did a book under the editorship of Jamie Glazoff that came out 2 years ago. I think it is now. Maybe it's a little less than that. And it was about the Obama policy towards Russia. It was my part of the book. But the guy who wrote the first chapter was a classmate of Obama's at Occidental, and he said Obama was a communist revolutionary at Occidental. Okay. He was a communist. And there's no point at which Obama in his biography talks about having an epiphany where he realized communism was wrong. Like Whittaker Chambers did. Well, like anyone that leaves the communist movement must have a break.
The person I mentioned, she went to another left-wing university in California, Nancy Faeser. It was the New College of California School of Law. Pretty left-wing people there, so there's that.
Yeah, there's a lot of that, and so it's very interesting. And Obama had this ambition from the very beginning, this notion that he was going to be president. And maybe the Marxists that educated him saw this hope that he'd be the first black president, because there's testimony from people that knew him. The postman, I think it was the postman. Was it at his grandparents' house that he spoke to and said, "Yeah, one day I'm going to be president," And then there was the allegation about the black actor who trained Obama to act presidential, trained him in the 1990s, saying that that he basically had said to him, "Yeah, I'm going to be president forever. When I'm president, I'm going to be president forever."
Yeah, so there's it's that slick delivery, right? It's that way Obama talks. He's like this and blah 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 blah. He's very slick, very good in front of a camera.
He acts very dignified. He puts on airs that make him have more gravity, right? Yeah. But the thing is that, and of course, it is Mr. Cahill wrote the book Dreams of
My Father.
I forget the name of the book, but it's about dreams. It was about the fact that he's an expert in literature, and Cahill is, and Cahill, basically to my satisfaction, and I didn't think anyone would prove that to my satisfaction, he proved to me that that the former head of the the former Marxist Leninist Weather Underground terrorist.
The Weatherman stuff. Oh no.
Had written large sections of Obama's autobiographical book, Dreams of My Father. Is that it? Dreams of My Father. I think that was the title of the book. But Cahill pointed out one of the decisive things in the book, and it's the Weather Underground guy that I'm forgetting his name right now, but he is in the Chicago area, and in fact, Obama started his political career, announced it in their living room. He was married to another Weather Underground terrorist who was wanted in connection with the killing of an Oakland police officer in a bombing.
Yeah, I read that book about. This was the FBI book, I think, by Weiner, who also wrote about the CIA. In his FBI book, he talks about the Weather Underground and how they were surveilled, and then they disappeared from the radar. Apparently, they acquired new spycraft, a new level of expertise, and you couldn't see them anymore. So we can all guess where this new spycraft came from, how they became
Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn. Exactly. Bill Ayers and if you have a list of the leaders of the Weather Underground, and it's a Marxist-Leninist terrorist organization, Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn are going to appear at the top of the list, along with John Jacobs, Jeff Jones, Jim Mellon, Mark Rudd, Howie Machtinger, Diana Otten, and Terry Robbins. But they're at the top of the list. And of course, this is the Bill Ayers and Cahill makes the argument that, and this is the decisive argument for me, was that Bill Ayers was in the Merchant Marine, and all of his writings have frequent use sailors' metaphors taken from living on the sea in ships.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, Obama, who never went to sea, was never a sailor, his book, Dreams of My Father, uses lots of these metaphors.
Linguistic forensics, I think the FBI would call it. Yeah.
This is what Cahill does. And he goes through other things. And I think, and the fact that we know from others' testimony that by the testimony of others that Bill Ayers was asked to help Obama with the book, that Bill Ayers was said by mutual friends of theirs to have written large sections of it. And I don't think Obama was intellectually capable of writing a book, because he would have had to been a lot more literate and a lot more intelligent than I think he actually is. Not that he's stupid. I don't think he's stupid, but he's not. Yeah. The guy, according to a comedian who talked to the guy who trained Obama, this black actor said he's as dumb as a chicken. I wouldn't say that, but it could be. Somebody who is
depends on how much relevant stuff you have read, and if you're lacking that stuff, you're functionally stupid. Your IQ may be okay, but you're functionally stupid.
Well, was Obama promoted through school because he was a Marxist and he was a prize and they were grooming him? So did he really have to do? I saw Marxist students when I was a graduate student and doing grading. I saw them get A's for D- work because they were Marxists, and they were being promoted by my boss, the professor.
Yeah, so we got the same stuff. We got the same stuff. There's been quite a number of politicians here, leading politicians in Germany. People have looked into their doctoral thesis and whatnot, and nowadays, because we have not just the internet, we have more advanced tools, you can actually run an automated check if they plagiarize stuff.
Yes.
Yeah, and so the system would spit out so many instances of plagiarism that was not put in there as a quote with a reference, with a footnote. And so a number of politicians actually lost their PhD titles, and they had to step down from office.
Yeah. And of course, so this was a period, so you see the effect of the Cold War ending had this profound political effect on America, where people that could have never been elected to the office of president, given their background and the concerns, they slipped through. The people accepted them because there was no communist threat anymore. So who cares if his mentor was a communist, or who cares if he worked for a KGB front organization during the Vietnam War protesting the war? Who cares? That's the past. The Cold War is over. This is a page we're tearing out of our book of history, and we are saying, look, he looks like a good guy now. And so this is how we got them. But the Clintons were very, very keen. They went out and they got lists. They got FBI files on members of Congress and generals, which Hillary held onto, and they started looking at generals who to promote and who not to. And this is when you get the first of the. And I've had retired generals tell me this, that they were promoting. They wanted to promote generals who had held privately to the left views. And they wanted any sign of outward conservatism or anti-communism, they didn't want them promoted, because they didn't want, if they were going to socialize America, they didn't want a reaction coming from the military leadership, right? No 7 days in May if they were going to surrender key things in negotiations with the Soviets or the Russians.
There was talk about what they called convergence, East-West convergence in the 90s and then onwards, where there was like a mirror organization in Russia of the, I think the American Council on Foreign Relations, one of the stuff. So the Russians, they tried to create some sort of a weird copy of it so they can look more legit, and then they started to talk more with Americans, and they promoted this concept of East-West convergence, and this went on even when the Ford Foundation financed a lot of groups. So this was always about convergence. We can make East and West more familiar to create maybe more stability in world peace and whatnot. So this was how they sold it internally, maybe.
Yeah. The thing is that if it's true, and of course everything is difficult in terms of the truth and proving, but if it's true, and we have all this evidence that the Clintons were a stealth communist,
Plant.
part of a stealth communist group, planted in the federal government, people that hated the cause of anti-communism, who protested for the communist Viet Cong and North Vietnamese during the Vietnam War, who were on the side of the communists in this past conflict. They were coming into power now, and this created a pressure on the rest of the world. So the pressure could be seen in South Africa, where South Africa finally found its strategic position hopeless, because now they're cut off from any help from America. They're cut off from help from the UK. They're not going to be able to sustain themselves. And the same thing, you had Jonas Savimbi fighting the communists in Angola. He ends up being shot by a sniper, I think, at the end of the 1990s. So all of the anti-communists in Africa are getting cut off. So then you have the surrender of the National Party to the African National Congress. And so you've had nothing but African National Congress rule in South Africa since 1994.
Yeah, the ANC, the party of Nelson Mandela, right?
The party of Nelson Mandela, who was a communist terrorist.
Who was let go in the 90s or something? This was...
No, he was released from prison, and then this negotiation happened.
In the 90s?
In the 90s. And it was 94, this transition happened in South Africa, where we're going to end apartheid. We're going to end the National Party having, they were going to allow equality. But of course, the blacks outnumbered the whites in South Africa like 4-1 in population. Not quite, because there's also an Indian minority. So I'm not sure exactly what the numbers, but it's something like, 24% white, some percentage Indians, the rest black. At the time, I'm not recalling the exact numbers.
If people want to look that up, I think it was called Project Coast. This was sort of a weird thing that the British were doing with their partners. So you're talking about British aristocracy. You're talking about I think it was called the 1001 Club. They presented themselves as green, saving animals, saving the environment and stuff, but they had some stuff going on in South Africa. I think it was called Project Coast.
Well, yes, the British, I should note, the British supplied mercenaries in the Angola War, because the CIA couldn't. CIA didn't have mercenary resources. The British really, from the SAS, they had these brilliant commando people who were just expert at guerrilla warfare, and the British just excelled at this, and their mercenaries were helping the anti-communist cause in Angola. And of course, this Angola war, South Africa actually engaged, and you had Cuban troops in Angola, right? And the Russian advisors were all over the place. So you had these battles. This was a very significant war. And South Africa, of course, its troops were involved. So South Africa was fighting this war. And of course, South Africa was getting embargoed. Here, South Africa is fighting communism. And you have with the Clintons, I believe it was started under the Clintons. It might have begun just before the Clintons. You had Krugerrands. You weren't allowed to sell Krugerrands.
The gold coins, yeah.
The gold coins from South Africa, which is one of their major exports, was to export gold. And their Krugerrand coins are they're just fine gold. They're 0.999% fine gold. Some of the best gold in the world is mined in South Africa. And of course, South Africa is suffering from all of this. And of course, South Africa, as a pariah nation, is working with Taiwan, that also does not have diplomatic relations with the West, although it gets help. South Africa was working on a nuclear bomb, and there was rumors that they were trying to get maybe sell a bomb to Taiwan. But South Africa had supposedly developed a nuclear weapon. There was an anomalous phenomena in the ocean off of South Africa that, and I'm not sure what the state of scientific opinion is about it, was a probable nuclear test by South Africa. So this is a very sophisticated country, South Africa, and an extremely rich country. People would walk barefoot to South Africa from as far away as Kenya to get work in the mines, because more than most of the gross national product of sub-Saharan Africa was located in the Rand, in that wealthy part of South Africa that was so productive. And of course, it was they had a system that it was created by one of their great statesmen around 1960. This apartheid system. It wasn't black slavery. It was a separation of groups because South Africa was tribal. It wasn't just one black tribe. There were multiple tribes, and it was very complicated how it worked. And of course, all these tribes didn't even get along with each other. So, but the communists had the idea of using, Joe Slovo was the head of the Communist Party of South Africa. He was actually a Soviet. He was I think it was he Lithuanian or was he Latvian? He was reputed to be a KGB colonel. And he was the head of the South African Communist Party. He was from the Soviet Union, basically. And supposedly they were directing, the ANC was basically just a front they had taken over, the African National Congress. So this struggle for African civil rights, black African civil rights, because there's white Africans and black Africans there. The struggle for black African civil rights was all caught up with with the communists who had kind of captured it. This made it very complicated. And of course, Rhodesia had fallen before, we talked about before, had fallen to the communists under Robert Mugabe. So here it was another white-governed African country, which had a much larger population of white people, much more significant. They weren't a tiny minority like they were in Rhodesia. They were a large minority of white people in South Africa. This became a real problem because Africa is strategic. It's the mineral storehouse of Africa. It is one of the most rich areas of the world in strategic minerals, not just gold, but I think platinum and various other strategic metals. So, and it's also the Cape Sea route, which I mentioned before. The big tankers have to go near it to go around, and so South Africa's descent into communism, and of course the ANC would not outwardly show its communism, and the communists use anti-white racism as a lubricant, shall we say. In that. So South Africa, so that war ended there in South Africa, and it ended with a tremendous communist victory. And then in 1997, 3 years after this, Laurent Kabila triggered a communist revolution, overthrew Mobutu Sese Seko, who was like the Shah of Iran, had cancer, had fled the country. I think he was receiving cancer treatments maybe in France, if I'm remembering, or Switzerland. So you had a communist revolution in Congo, which is, again, a mineral-rich country, a very large, one of the larger sub-Saharan African countries. And, of course, a massive civil war developed out of this communist revolution, which lasted for years. We don't know how many millions have died. And the massacre between the Tutsis and in Rwanda that's connected to that. And so a lot of the violence in Africa is connected to communist attempts to take over the subcontinent of sub-Saharan Africa. And the advances of communism and the advances of China and Russia in those regions. Basically, the European interests are hanging by a thread in those areas.
Yeah, and maybe an interesting side note here. This is connected to this. It's about Elon Musk. He was born in South Africa, Pretoria, and his grandfather was director of an activist group called Technocracy Incorporated, and this was very leftist. They basically try to give a technological advanced image to socialism, and this group Technocracy Incorporated, they got into trouble in the West, I think especially in Canada. So then, yeah, exactly.
What
So
did they
this-
get in trouble about? What was that?
Well, because it was so radical. It was so leftist and it was so radical, and so there was even an arrest of an arrest of the grandfather of Elon Musk. So he got into trouble. This guy was called Joshua Norman Haldeman, the grandfather of Elon Musk. So then Haldeman, who was a truther, he was believing the conventional conspiracy mythology, and he moved his family to South Africa to join the fight against the international bankers and whatnot. And when he was there, he published more stuff about the international conspiracy, or what he thought it was, and so on and so forth. So this was like a group that said, we want a technocracy. They didn't even call it socialism. They said, this is a technocracy. It will be ruled by the scientists, and the scientists will give you a identity card or some sort of put you in a database from birth, and the scientists will then allocate resources to you until the time that you die. So it's socialism with a technological face. And so this guy sought his fame in South Africa, and this is kind of an interesting side note.
Well, it's the conflicts of the 1990s. The other conflict we should touch on. So we've touched on how the Angola War ended and what happened in South Africa. Again, a communist victory in Africa. 2 communist victories in 2 key African countries after the fall of the Soviet Union. We need to touch on what happened in Afghanistan and also Korea. So first, Afghanistan. What happened is that the Russians pulled out in '89 of Afghanistan, and Mohammad Najibullah, the Bull, was a former head of the Afghan KGB and became president of Afghanistan, was still in power. And when the Soviets left. And of course, what he did was he pretended to convert to Islam.
Oh, no.
But even though he was a dedicated Marxist-Leninist. But anyway, he held on to power after the fall of the Soviet Union. He was still holding on. And it was of course, you have people showing up there like bin Laden in Afghanistan, and you had this idea of this giant offensive to bring down the Najibullah regime. I think it was in '94. And of course, Russ Schultheis, who was a journalist who hung out in Afghanistan, he wrote a beautiful book, Night Letters from Wartime Afghanistan. It's a beautiful book, beautifully written book with lots of photography about the Mujahideen fighting the communist regime. He really got very close to them. He talks at the end of the book about being on the road to Kandahar during this offensive. Now, while this is going on, Obama's going around to all the Mujahideen groups saying the Americans are your real enemies. Because the Americans are really working against Islam. They're working against you. They've got troops in Saudi Arabia because they defended the Saudi regime, and they're soiling the holy city, or the holy ground of Islam. And so he was making Osama bin Laden was making a big deal about how America's the big enemy and Israel, not Moscow, not Najibullah.
Yeah, it's conspiracy mythology, right? This is traditional conspiracy mythology.
Right, exactly. This is the conspiracy mythology that Osama bin Laden went to Afghanistan after he was kicked out of Sudan, where he was living. He had been kicked out of Saudi Arabia. He was so bad, but he had at his elbow his chief advisor. And this is the way the Russians like it, was Ayman al-Zawahiri. People say Zawahiri, but I was taught that word is said Zawahiri when I was a kid, because we had a game with that name from Egypt, right, that we played. He was an Egyptian, Zawahiri was, but he was trained KGB agent. And this was brought out by Alexander Litvinenko, the Russian FSB defector, who was who of course was assassinated dramatically with radioactive polonium in 2006, and died a horrible death of radiation poisoning on what is in America Thanksgiving Day that year, after being poisoned on the 1st of November. It took about 3 weeks to kill him. Horrible death. And of course, he said, Putin is behind this. Putin killed me. But what Litvinenko had done is he testified to the fact that Ayman al-Zawahiri was in Russia, in Dagestan, being trained to do the job he was going to do in Afghanistan. And of course, Litvinenko was in charge of Zawahiri's security when he was in Dagestan, in Russia. That's a province of Russia, by the way, Dagestan, where he was trained at this facility. And of course, part of Litvinenko's mission was to even keep Zawahiri's presence in Russia secret from the Russian Interior Minister. Even they were not allowed to know he was there. So here you have bin Laden with Zawahiri at his elbow, who is a longtime KGB agent and has been connected by some to the assassination of Anwar Sadat, by the way. In what was that, 1980, 81, I think Sadat was assassinated. So there you have Zawahiri at Osama bin Laden's elbow, pushing this anti-American agenda in the middle of the end of the war against the communist regime in Afghanistan. And of course, you have in the north at the same time, you have Ahmad Shah Massoud, who is tasked by the CIA to cut Najibullah's supply line. Was what had been a couple of years earlier, and had not done it. Had taken it was a half $500,000 from the CIA, and he didn't do it. CIA was mad at him for that. But there were rumors. If you read the book on Afghanistan by the guy that was in charge of doing our Afghan thing, whose name is eluding me, he says in the book that it's possible that at the right hand of Ahmad Shah Massoud, there was a KGB agent codenamed the Advisor. And some have speculated that Ahmad Shah Massoud's chief of intelligence, Mohammad Fahim, was that KGB agent. Because they were ethnic Afghan Tajiks, and Tajikistan is a Soviet republic. And there's the story that Fahim trained in Soviet Tajikistan to perform his mission. And then you had Rashid Dostum, who was an Uzbek, and there's Soviet Uzbekistan. He was an Afghan Uzbek, supposedly Afghan. He might have been a Soviet Uzbek, who worked for the Najibullah regime at first, and then switched sides, became Islamic, and then joined with Ahmad Shah Massoud in the north. They became the Northern Alliance. And so when the Najibullah regime fell, it was these guys that took over. It was the Uzbek, and then there was another fellow who later was implicated in the drug business. I forget his name. He was a leader of the Pushtun, majority Pushtun rebel groups. Turned out he was taking money from the Soviets behind the table. So it seems like most of the Mujahideen groups that were fighting the communist regime were infiltrated and controlled from Moscow, right? They had Moscow's agents in them. So and it was actually Massoud's group that actually dominated the Afghan government after the takeover, but the ethnic disputes, because Afghanistan is a patchwork of ethnicities, a civil war erupted after the fall of Najibullah. So then Najibullah didn't even bother leaving Kabul. He went to the UN compound in Kabul, and he stayed there. His family went to India. And so Najibullah was there, and the civil war was happening between these different Mujahideen groups. The United States had pulled out, didn't care anymore. And there was Osama bin Laden. Now, the story I read, and there's different versions of the story denying this, that when Osama bin Laden went to stay with the Mujahideen groups, he was with Ahmad Shah Massoud's group and Mohammad Fahim. But when the Taliban, a funny thing happened. I have a history of the Afghan war that is very peculiar. And what happened was that a plane. This is what triggered the Taliban to come into existence. A Russian aircraft carrying 10 million rounds of ammunition was forced down at Kandahar by a Afghan fighter plane. And they said, what is a Russian plane doing delivering supplies to the government at Kandahar? And they said, oh, well, we're Russian crew. This is from Moscow. The Moscow's supporting they're supporting Ahmad Shah Massoud and Dostum and the other fellow whose name I can't remember that took over, that were basically controlling the situation in Kabul. And this made the rounds, all the Pushtun groups, and the Taliban, the students of the Quran, the students of Islam, they became this wave, and they were supported by the Pakistani ISI, Pakistani Intelligence Service, and they just created an irresistible wave, and they swept into Kabul, and they pushed the Northern Alliance back up to the former Soviet border, where they were pinned down, where Dostum, Rashid Dostum, and Ahmad Shah Massoud were pinned down back against the former Soviet border, and the Taliban took over, and that's Osama bin Laden went over to the Taliban then, and the Taliban hosted him then. And this was perfect for the alibi. He could not be connected then to Russia. Him and his KGB advisor could not be traced back to Russia. And from there, he could hatch his plots to bring down the Twin Towers and set the Pentagon on fire.
Oh boy, yeah. I mean, I've looked.
Is that amazing?
Yeah, I've looked at the Taliban. I've looked at the Pakistanis with the ISI, and of course you have the Brits again mingling in all of this, and it's this sort of argument that we've heard so many times before when the Brits say to the Americans, oh, we know this area, we have experience in this area, we'll do some operations and we'll keep you posted. But who knows what the British were concocting there, because the British, they were infiltrated so badly, and it's funny when you have these British connections and when you have some Americans trying to establish connections or having some connections. This is of course then picked up by the Russian propaganda, and they say, well, the CIA totally ran Osama and they ran all the stuff and they run the whole Pakistanis and whatnot. But it's like people don't actually look that close. They don't pick up the literature and they look into it. Or they don't look into it to find out what are the most important connections there, who was really running these operations. And of course, when you have the Taliban, of course they need to have some sort of a connection with the Americans, but this is then used later by the propaganda, and this went on especially then in the 90s when some of the stuff was going on. And then of course when 9/11 happened, this was then turned into a very, very big deal to say the CIA did 9/11 and all that. But we saw Russia benefiting from 9/11 10 times over. And this was even in mainstream media, and I quoted this on various occasions. You had CNN stories, you had other stories quoting experts saying, yeah, the Russians are really, really profiting from 9/11.
Yeah, and of course that takes us out of the 20th century. But the other conflict that is important in our context, that's a 20th century one. The Korean War, of course, ended with an armistice or a ceasefire rather, and of course was brewing. And of course, by the time you get to 1994. They see that North Korea is going to get a bomb, an atomic weapon, and it looks like a nuclear war, possibly a very devastating war, is brewing on the Korean Peninsula. And of course, I actually I attended a 2-day conference on this at the George Bush Center in April of 2001, where I got to meet Defense Secretary William Perry, who a lot of people credited for averting war at the time. And of course, the solution of the Clinton administration was they made a deal. Clinton made a deal with North Korea. We will give you, your people are starving, we'll give you food, we'll give you cash, we'll give you money, and you don't develop a nuclear weapon.
But right? You get a reactor, and right? They gave the Koreans a reactor.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Well, we'll peaceful nuclear. We'll give you peaceful nuclear energy. Well, it's very fascinating. Well, what do you think if you make a deal with communists who want to get a bomb and you say, don't get the bomb, we'll give you money and food, and you buy them off? What do you think you're going to get for your money?
Yeah.
Well, 6 years later, 6.5 years later, in the year 2001, I'm at the George Bush Center, and that was where the announcement was made, simultaneous announcement at the Pentagon, by the way, where a Marine Corps general, the head Marine Corps general in South Korea, who I sat next to at dinner that night, he gave the briefing on how they now knew in April of 2001 that North Korea had at least 2 nuclear weapons. And this was the shocking announcement that, and of course, yet they had a dinner, celebrating William Perry's success in avoiding war. You avoided war, but they got a nuclear weapon anyway, and you paid for it. And I was just amazed at this. And I remember that I was standing with William Perry and the South Korean ambassador to Russia because I wanted to talk to her. I was interested in her insights into Russia at the time. And this Greek official of the International Atomic Energy comes up to William Perry, the former defense secretary of the U.S., and he says, Mr. Secretary, do you know there are power lines running from Pyongyang to the North Korean nuclear program? Do those power lines carry power from Pyongyang to the project or from the project to Pyongyang? And William Perry looked and said, well, I don't know. I need to check on that.
I should maybe look into this.
Yeah, I'm going to look into this. And this Greek guy, his face lit up, and he said, and he had this grin on his face, and he scurried away. And so I scurried because he was one of the inspectors in North Korea. He was one of the IAEA inspectors. And I chased after him and I said, hey, and he turned around and I said, you knew the answer to that question.
Don't you run away from me. Don't you run away from me.
Face. He knew if you were watching him and Secretary Perry at that moment, you would know that this guy knew the answer to the question he was asking. And I said, you knew the answer to that question that you asked him. And he said, yes, he did know. And I said, so what is the answer? Does the power run? Which way does the power run? And he says, oh, the North Koreans are very clever. The power lines are dummies. There's not power running to or from there. I said, wait a minute. You mean the North Korean nuclear weapons program is a dummy? And then he repeated himself. He said, oh, the North Koreans are very clever people. And I said, so what? The Chinese gave them the bomb? And he shook his head, no. And I said, the Russians gave them the bomb. Yeah. And then he wouldn't answer. He wouldn't answer. And I said, I see.
Yeah, and we know that the big missile that the Koreans now have, I think is a actual intercontinental ballistic missile, the Hwasong-17, I think it's called. It has supposedly a Russian engine, a Russian rocket engine. Oh, yes. I think the hull is Russian.
Well, you see, the thing is that the North Korean military gets its conventional weapons as hand-me-downs from China, but they get their missiles and their more advanced weaponry from Russia. And this was something Peter Pry revealed in his writings and so on, because he's been working, he was the head of he was on the EMP task force, and he was working on EMP all the way to the end of his life. And there was a Russian general who came to warn us back in the early 2000s, I think it was, that maybe it was around 2006 or 7, this Russian general said the scientists that made the Russian super EMP weapon were working with the North Koreans on their bomb, which showed that Russian scientists were using North Korea as a site for nuclear testing. So I think that Russia's been conducting nuclear underground tests via North Korea all the while we haven't been able to do any real tests. And so I think that's what they used North Korea for, is they used it to test their weapons, their more advanced weapons like Super EMP. And Peter showed that the signature of these detonations, these underground detonations, it was a low blast in yield, like a EMP weapon would have. It's high in the electromagnetic spectrum, low in the blast in yield in certain parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. So and so there's reason to believe the Russians really are the ones behind the North Korean nuclear program. And this is very alarming because it shows this is what they've been doing all along behind our back.
Yeah, it's like a Joker card. I mean, I've looked at how North Korea sort of developed, and they claimed at some point or very early on that North Korea was its own thing. It had its own brand of communism. It was separate from China and Russia and all that nonsense. So they cultivated this image for a long time. And so the whole country of North Korea is like made for a nuclear war. The Koreans could launch an ICBM against America. The Russians could say, we have nothing to do with this. The Chinese can say the same. And the Americans could retaliate, but all the important stuff with the North Koreans is underground. So this is a way to attack America. Russia and China pretend to be innocent, and then they can play this. They can try to,
Yeah, and now North Korea has, between 25 and 35 strategic nuclear warheads. With the capability to deliver them to North America. They also have 2 satellites that pass over the United States every day. And of course, the problem about these satellites is could there be nuclear warheads in those satellites? This is something Peter Pry worried about. And of course, nobody knows, but what I would say is that this is emblematic. And when Boris Yeltsin goes to try to embarrass Bill Clinton by saying, you have not upheld the ABM treaty. And basically Clinton says, what do you mean? We just want to defend against rogue states. Well, here Russia's gone to the trouble to set up North Korea as a possible a country that could attack and devastate the United States without Russia receiving any retaliation. If they could get North Korea to do it for them, the United States could be wrecked without Russia having to risk itself. And here, the U.S. was working its way towards having some ballistic missile defenses to stop a North Korean attack, which was thwarting Russia's plans. And Yeltsin was upset by that. It's really telling when you look at the details of the conversations between Russian and American leaders, what the Russians are really doing. If you have a strategic eye and you say, oh my gosh, that's devious, that's really nasty. And now you see the mask, they've ripped the mask off now, and we see that there are enemies and that it's just like this savage face of drooling with blood, knocking down cities and murdering, kidnapping, tens of thousands of Ukrainian children and raping women and just murdering people. The atrocities. This is the face of the old Bolshevik regime. This is the face of Stalin.
A couple of years ago, I saw something. Because I have an eye on influencers in Germany, in Europe, of course other places too. So I look what the activists are doing, and then there was this one guy. He was kind of popular on the web. He died a few years ago, and he was always pro-Russia. He started to become a thing in 2008. That's of course when the Russians launched their new propaganda offensive. Interesting coincidence there. So always pro-Russia, and then at some point this guy actually said that he was going to go on a skiing trip to North Korea. Now this sounded absolutely grotesque, but he was selling this to his audience as a perfectly legitimate way of spending his free time. Nice ski slopes, very nice country, he said, and all that nonsense. And this was sort of a watershed moment when influencers who were very, very anti-American, and they talked about 9/11 and talked about everything, when they started to promote North Korea, of all places, very crazy, outlandish thing. But, once you start selling it and you keep repeating it, eventually the audience will buy it, because the traditional conspiracy mythology says that the windmills of Zion are the worst thing. Obviously, they don't exist, but they are the worst. Everybody else is better than the Jewish world conspiracy. So you got to work with the Russians and the Chinese and the North Koreans, because anything, we have to do anything to fight this conspiracy. Should we talk a bit about, the truthers in the 90s and Oklahoma City?
Yes, that is the beginning of trying to turn Americans against each other by using conspiracy narratives. That definitely, Clinton basically said that his reelection depended on that event. That event propelled him into the White House, the Oklahoma City bombing. Oh. Kept him in the White House, I should say. So, maybe and there's only one more little conflict area that we should talk about at the very ending. We haven't touched on the Yugoslav war. Maybe I should just mention that the defector Jan Šejna from Czechoslovakia, in his book "We Will Bury You," said that Yugoslavia would be broken up along ethnic lines, that was the Moscow's long-range plan after Tito's death, and that indeed is what happened. And then we saw the Yugoslav Civil War in the 1990s. So I should mention that. And also at the very end of the 1990s, Hugo Chavez got elected president, basically a communist, a Marxist-Leninist, pretending to be a populist leftist, got elected in Venezuela as president. And of course, this was the work of the Sao Paulo Forum, which was formed by Lula da Silva and Fidel Castro at the end of the Cold War, to try to create a communist bloc in South America. And so this is something that was developed in the 1990s as well, as the Cold War didn't really end, right? Communism was still there advancing. So go ahead, let's talk about the Oklahoma City bombing.
All right. So in general, I studied 200 years worth of conspiracy media. People can find a book on this that I've published. You can find that on Amazon as a print book and also as an ebook. So obviously, I've looked at everything that happened in the 90s. And so it's noteworthy that the conspiracy authors and the radio hosts and everything, they completely lost interest in Russia, starting in the 90s. So they started to talk about UFOs a lot and aliens, and they were rehashing some old material, kind of the bread and butter stuff about the bankers and Jewish people and whatnot. So this was like an era when you grew up in that era, or you were becoming an adult or were an adult in the 90s, you just didn't hear much of anything about Russia. It was always about, this grand conspiracy. So for many people in general in the 90s, you grew up, you don't know anything about the Russians, you don't know much about the Cold War, it's just very far away from you. So this was a perfect fit for the Russian strategy, in the 90s. The Russians did not want a specific type of attention. If you looked at, the long-term communist plans and what they were doing, the Russians wanted everybody to focus on other things. And so you had these horrible best-selling books in the 90s, like Behold a Pale Horse by Cooper and stuff like that. And so in the early 90s, you saw, especially when Clinton became president, you saw more right-wing activity, conservative activity, groups that formed, everything. But that, a lot changed when the Oklahoma City bombing happened. This was a very serious discrediting event. And, interestingly enough, Tim McVeigh was a truther. He was a classic standard truther. He was reading, even when he was in the military, he was in the Gulf War, right? He was He was, I
Yes,
think,
he was in the U.S. Army.
he was
Yeah.
one of the best gunners, I believe, on a Bradley tank or something. So he had almost like a perfect score. He was very disciplined. He wanted to rise up the ranks, and eventually, even before he was in the Gulf War, he wanted to join Special Forces. So that was his dream. He wanted to become a super soldier. But even when he was in the military, he was handing out stuff, I think, from the John Birch Society, and he was into this novel. What was it called? The crazy white power novel, The Turner Diaries. Right, so
The Turner Diaries, yes.
it's this crazy novel about.
And if I'm not mistaken, Turner is an anti-Semite, right? He's a virulent anti-Semite.
Yeah, it's very racist and crazy, and the sort of a terrorist strategy of provoking everybody and provoking other people's actions, and then it becomes a civil war, and even nuclear weapons are being used, and the white race survives. Sort of, that's kind of the stuff that he was into. And this was fairly common in, truther circles. He was a complete and utter conspiracy believer activist. Now, when the bombing happened, of course, the activists out there, they were horrified because, everybody looked bad. So they tried to paint Tim McVeigh as a deep cover agent of the grand globalist conspiracy, even though he was one of them. He was a truther. So I looked at that case, just get the best literature on this, because there's also bad literature on this, obviously. So this was a federal building, the Alfred P. Murrah building in Oklahoma City, so of course back then the so-called feds were the enemy. Anybody who had an office there, the ATF, everybody was regarded as an enemy. And the idea that Tim McVeigh had was that the globalists, Bush and these globalists would soon launch a grand coup d'etat of some sort in America. They would disarm the patriots, put them in concentration camps, have tanks rolling around with United Nations flags. The power of government would largely be handed over to the United Nations. So people were waiting for this event. Now, of course, now it's so many decades later, this event still hasn't happened. But back then, people were thinking, this is going to happen. We need to do something drastic now. We cannot wait. And as far as we can tell, Tim McVeigh had a fairly normal childhood, not a happy childhood. His parents were working all the time, and that became sort of mingled with this conspiracy thing. The capitalist conspiracy was forcing his parents to be away all the time and whatnot. And he got a few bumps to the head. He got a few serious bumps to the head, loss of consciousness, brain damage, and that became an issue later in the Gulf War. He was not a criminal for a long time. No prior criminal history, wasn't known as a troublemaker. He tried different things in terms of a career, but then he got into the military and he got into the truthers. His favorite movies, or among his favorite movies, was the film Red Dawn, which is about a communist invasion where they parachute troops and these groups have to form. I think they're called the Wolverines, and they have to improvise and fight the commies. So that was his favorite movie back then. Mm-hmm. He was reading magazines like Soldier of Fortune and all that. And he started, he was working a lot. He wanted to be disciplined and make some money, but that just tired him out. He was pretty much worn out. So he wanted to join the special forces, but of course he wasn't qualified yet. So he joined the regular military, and he was hoping to be the best soldier, perfect score, always clean shoes, everything perfect. And at a later stage, he wanted to join the special forces. Now, it was a pretty bad experience for him, the Gulf War. He was interpreting the whole event according to conspiracy mythology. So the evil globalists, the elders of Zion, were concocting all of this. So they were shooting at the Iraqi military, blah, blah, blah. He just became obsessed with this framing, with this interpretation of it. And so when he was not in the military, when he was back home. He was going to gun shows. He was connecting with all sorts of activists like Terry Nichols. And at some point, he left the military because after the war, he was so worn out. He was not quite in the condition to be, tough enough for the selection process of the special forces. So he didn't want to be a regular soldier. He could have been a great regular soldier, moving up the ranks. Superiors liked him and everything. But he sort of went back to these old jobs that he was working, so burnt out, and getting deeper and deeper into conspiracy and right-wing activism. So that meant some weirdo schemes, with credit cards, fraud, and he got himself into this hole deeper and deeper and deeper. And this is sort of like a tactic that even intelligence agencies use. They will get you more into trouble, so your options become more and more limited. So the only people that still trust you and like you are the people from a specific group, like these activists. So anytime he got into trouble,
do you think that he was recruited by somebody in East German intelligence who was a double agent working for West German intelligence at Lohim City?
Definitely has to be looked into. There was this German guy who was actually related to a very important politician here who was infiltrating that whole scene. And so it's like a recruitment doesn't have to be in a traditional way. So like this guy is saying, hey, I'll work for important people, work for me, I can give you this and that. There's different kinds of recruitments or half recruitments where somebody advises you to do something and helps you, gets you out of trouble. But they call it rolling you down the hill. They get you into more trouble. And the more trouble you are with the United States government, the more you hate the government, the more you believe the conspiracy mythology. And so this is kind of his downward spiral. He was becoming a complete and utter activist. And he was seeing that other activists were passive. They were waiting for something to happen. He wanted to be someone who actually does something. So McVeigh and Nichols, they're starting to buy ammonium nitrate. So you can make this fuel bomb out of it. I think it's like they call it ANFO. It's like fuel oil.
A fertilizer bomb.
Yeah, fuel oil and ammonium nitrate. And they bought nitromethane. And they were stealing Tovex from, I think, a construction site or some kind of place that had it. And so they have this capability. And he was a kind of above average intelligence. He was perfectly capable of pulling off this attack, learning how to make a bomb, testing explosives, and figuring out how this stuff works. Because some people will claim he could never do this, he could blah blah blah. No. He was really capable of doing this stuff. And we don't know who helped him exactly and what connections these helpers really had.
There seems to be some bungling by the FBI, some covering up of certain details, depending on the journalist that you trust in this matter. And there was a claim there was a Saudi intelligence officer possibly peripherally involved as well. Not a Saudi, sorry, Iraqi Saddam Hussein had maybe sent an intelligence officer there, but
because that's how
I don't know that
it works the same in left-wing terrorist circles as in right-wing terrorist circles. Oh, you meet somebody and that person says, "Oh, I know this guy. I can introduce you to this guy and he can help you with whatever the heck." And he was. So the plan was.
So how many? There was a preschool right near where the bomb went off, and it killed all these children.
So
preschool children.
One of the ideas was to detonate the bomb at night when nobody was there to make this statement against the feds, the federal agencies and whatnot. But and supposedly McVeigh didn't know about this child care center that was in the building. He had this all worked out, and he tried to get all the details right, but of course he got things wrong. So his plan was to conduct the attack and then just go underground and link up to a group like the National Alliance or Elohim City. But these groups were very much infiltrated by various players. So, for example, there was this German guy. He was actually an agent His name was Andreas Karl Strassmayer. He was actually, get this, he was the son, I can't even believe I'm saying this, he was the son of the chief of staff of Helmut Kohl, the German chancellor. He was the son of the chief of staff of the German chancellor, right? And so
1994, of all times. This is a very strange. I mean, and of course, he's there. What is he doing in Elohim City? And is this son a double agent?
Now he was interviewed, of course, because he was evacuated. He just left and made some conflicting statements afterwards, and he was tracked down by journalists. I think Spiegel magazine and others, they found him and they asked him about it, and he gave this convoluted story of his job was to spy on right-wing circles because he was a German. He could pass off as a neo-Nazi and play that role, blah, blah, blah. But his statements never really were convincing.
Well, since when did what? He was spying on Elohim City with the cooperation of the FBI? What is that?
He would never really say that. I mean, he would be asked that question, and I looked up the interviews that he gave to German media, and they were asking him about, American connections and this and that, but he would always say no, it was very limited, very very small in scale, and when this went south, he just left because he didn't want to get arrested and all that. There was another spy that we know of. This was a source of the ATF agency in Elohim City. And this source, this informant, was reporting Strassmayer. She was, I think it was a woman, and she was warning about Strassmayer. She didn't know, of course, that he was attached to, whatever. She was saying that this guy is potentially dangerous. So,
and Strassmayer working for West German intelligence.
Yeah, sort of, but he would never really say exactly in what capacity and exactly who was his handler.
I mean, this is a really, you got a major terrorist event, the biggest terrorist event to that point on American soil, and you have a German spy involved, connected to it, and you don't question him, you don't get to the bottom of it?
Yeah, of course, obviously he should have been debriefed. Maybe he was, and we never get to hear about it. And, German intelligence is, of course, a problem. It's a mess. Now, of course, we have the Interior Intelligence Agency, which is very small, and it's always been infiltrated. You can look up all the scandals, highest ranking intelligence people who worked for the Soviets and everything. It's horrible. Then we have the Foreign Intelligence Service, which has also been very much infiltrated again and again, and this became public, so we know the names, we know who worked for the Soviets after all. So it's a huge issue. It's a huge cluster of problems when we get this German agent at that place at that specific time, because if he was following orders of his superior, we don't know who his superior ultimately worked for. If this guy was working for maybe the Russians or whoever. Right, huge problems.
Right,
so,
we don't know, and then of course this was so helpful to Mr. Clinton in getting him reelected president.
Oh yeah.
I should add a footnote to Timothy McVeigh. Timothy McVeigh was convicted and sentenced to death. He was put in a maximum security prison together with one of his people locked up with him was Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, who was a famous left-wing environmental terrorist. He blew up people. He sent mail bombs to people, blew up all kinds of folks. I don't remember how many people he killed and maimed. It's quite a number. And they had hunted him for a long time. Well, Kaczynski was in this maximum security, and they became friends. And there's a book about this, and in which Kaczynski's quoted after Timothy McVeigh's execution. He said, Tim was a good guy. He said, Tim had this idea that we should join forces, the far left and the far right, because we had the same enemy.
Yeah. When in 1996, a novel was published called Unintended Consequences, and the plot is about so-called patriots who assassinate members of the government, government officials. And so this is like this big grand strategy. And McVeigh really liked this novel, that came out in '96. So he basically thought that I should have picked that strategy, instead of making this truck bomb and blowing up this building. I should have done it the other way, just attack and withdraw, kind of like what the Unabomber did, because he was sitting like in this little cabin hut in Montana, I think it was. So he was completely off the grid. He barely existed in an official capacity. And he was making these packages with bombs, and he was sending it to people that represented to him technology, because he thought technology was the root cause of all evil, and we should all live in a cabin in the woods and, live inside nature. So he thought by destroying the infrastructure, by destroying the people, you can destroy evil. And so that was why the Unabomber was so hard to catch, because he was in the middle of nowhere. But ultimately, he was caught by through his own vanity. He had a very high IQ, I think in the 150s. I think he was a mathematician by his training. And he worked for a couple of years, made some money, bought this property in the middle of nowhere. So he was arrogant, highly intelligent, but then he wrote these letters, and he wrote this manifesto, I think something like the industrial society and its problems, or whatever it was called. And so the FBI started to do, forensic linguistics. They tried to analyze his style of writing. And his manifesto was written in the style of a dissertation, a scientific text. But it was kind of outdated in style. So they thought he was probably a bit older, and he had a scientific background. He was not just some nobody with a low level of education. And this is kind of how they created a profile. And at some point, some of, I think, his relatives or somebody recognized the details, and they gave a tip to the authorities. I think that's how he was called. Yeah. But this is not how it went for McVeigh. I mean, McVeigh thought he had it all planned out. He had an escape vehicle. But he was stopped by police because the vehicle wasn't perfect. The registration or the taillight or whatever.
Yeah, I think it was a taillight, maybe.
Yeah,
I don't remember.
They arrested him for this infraction, and only when he was in jail, that's when the police actually realized that he's the prime suspect in the Oklahoma City bombing, because the FBI conducted a search, the cars and the apartments of Nichols, and they found some evidence in the trash can. There was a hand-drawn map of Oklahoma City in the Murrah building, and there were some other things where McVeigh slipped up, so he left traces, and then the FBI could pull the pieces together. So this was a bad day for the truthers, for the radical, the radical truthers. So immediately they did the standard program, which is the same program that the Russians use. Whenever something like this happens, Oklahoma City, 9/11, whatever, they always say it was the feds, the CIA or some other federal agencies.
An inside job.
It's the globalists behind it, the elders of Zion behind it, and the people involved are just patsies or agents, deep cover agents run by whatever. And this is sort of the standard program, which the activists then used. So you had Alex Jones doing stuff about the Oklahoma City thing and many others. And this became sort of this ever-growing idea of how this all went down. There are some interesting anomalies that should be looked at, but it's always this pre-ready-made assumption or conclusion. They start with the conclusion. It must have been the feds. It must be the globalists. And then they try to find anything that will fit this narrative, and they really don't look at anything else. And some of these guys that did material on OKC, and also the earlier thing with Waco. This was in '93, right? The Waco siege?
Waco was, 93, yes.
Yeah, and then I think there was another one, the Ruby Ridge incident.
Ruby Ridge, yes, and where the wife was really the conspiracy theorist more than the husband, and this is John Ronson in his book Them Adventures with Extremists. He went up there and he interacted with him, and he felt genuine compassion for this man whose son was shot. The son went after his dog. The FBI and the ATF had surrounded this place with snipers. They shot his son. They shot his wife holding his baby. It was really a black eye for the U.S. government because they mishandled this. This should not have caused anybody's deaths. This guy had not really done anything wrong. His wife was a crazy conspiracy theorist, but these people weren't really dangerous. Yeah, they were just trying to twist his arm into being a government informer, and he didn't want to do it.
And you
want to be a government informer.
You saw sort of a new generation of activists doing reports on Waco, Ruby Ridge, and Oklahoma City. People like Alex Jones. I mean, he actually went to Waco and he did some help, to rebuild the crazy church they had there or something. And there was I think, a documentary about Oklahoma City, and this became sort of a career-making thing. This is like the new guy. Alex Jones was the new guy in the 90s. He was using radio. He was using the early internet later in the 90s. He was doing his documentaries, and they were sold as VHS tapes and copied by people. They could actually make a dub of the tape and hand it to somebody else, going viral, some sort of. And so Alex Jones was building his career with this stuff, and then when 9/11 happened, it always was the same pattern, and always the same kind of interpretation of it, and it perfectly aligns with the Russian strategy and the Russian psychological warfare, because you never saw from the truthers, you never saw a professional analysis, you never saw anything that would be considered professional, really looking at the case and really focusing on the important bits and coming up with some sort of an assessment that would be of professional grade. It was always just reinforcing the stuff that the truthers already believed, and that even McVeigh believed. This is an attack by the globalists, and so we have to be more into this. We have to be more active and spread this stuff even further and fight this globalist conspiracy. Now, this was in the 90s. I think this is when Alex Jones launched his Police State series. There was like 4 movies ultimately. Police State 2000, Police State 2, The Takeover, and what they were called. And this was sort of a grand narrative of this United Nations conspiracy idea. The United Nations would take over America and lock up the patriots, and they would stuff these patriots in these concentration camps, run by FEMA. So this was kind of the paranoia that this event will come, that this big day will come when the patriots would have to fight. Now, obviously, this hasn't happened. There was no mass arrests of patriots. They're not stuffed into concentration camps run by FEMA. The United Nations is not running America really, and this is not like what they said it was going to be. This was sort of the scene in the 90s. They were focused on those topics. They were not really talking about Russia. They were not really talking about China that much. It was always focused on these domestic topics and reinforcing that old narrative. They were always quoting stuff from older conspiracy books, from the 60s and 70s, the Birch books, and they were quoting stuff that was even older. It was always the international bankers, always the Rothschilds running everything. So this was what people believed a lot back then. And then, of course, after 9/11 and the internet, it exploded.
Yeah, it was, and a lot of people I knew when I had my column at WorldNet Daily, a lot of this hangover when I started working for them in '99, a lot of the people that were reading me were saying, yeah, but what about the New World Order? Yeah. What about the Rothschilds? Why don't you talk about that? And it's like, those are vague first of all, the Rothschilds, what? And the New World Order? The New World Order is a phrase that George Bush used to refer to the post-Cold War world without a Soviet power in it. But they turned these phrases into organizations, into conspiracies, into this giant thing that had to be fought. And this is rather striking. And of course, this has been building all along. And this is one of the reasons why I noticed this connection between the anti-Semitic, the neo-Nazi right, conspiracy theory, and Russia, and how there are these linkages going all the way back to World War II and the Nazi diaspora, the Third Reich. And we'll see today. There was a guy I received, he was on one of the right-wing talk shows. He's a guy that knows a lot of the facts about Hitler we've talked about. But then he believes that Hitler was, basically a creature of the Zionist conspiracy. He was a Soviet Zionist agent, right? And then he lost World War II on purpose.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's pretty crazy, right? That the guy would commit suicide on purpose. I mean, it's just that, but this is the kind of poor reasoning. People can have the right facts, and if they believe this conspiracy stuff, they'll weave it into the wrong conclusions.
Yeah. I mean, when it was the year 2015 and 16 and all this craziness happened with the Q movement and everything, this is when authorities, the FBI and others, this is when they started to say in public, we're going to look into these truthers, if they have Russian connections, if this craziness is going on. But you have to, go back in history 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and even more. You have to go back even and analyze the past if this Russian connection was there much earlier. We saw this moment in 2008 when the truthers started to become very much pro-Russia. But, back in the 2000s and the 90s, this all was along the same lines. This was kind of building up the movements to be used later, to be used at a later stage.
Yeah. Now we've gotten to the end of the 20th century. I think we touched on most every conflict. Of course, we couldn't touch on everything. And, I'm going by memory over vast subjects. I've gotten the books around me to look up things. But, and if we've made mistakes, it's only natural. What we've attempted is really huge. But, I would say, what are we going to deal with next? And maybe the listeners would like to have us tackle certain subjects they could put in. But we have the Trump's trial right now with his conviction this week. This is a big piece of news. We got the American elections coming up. We've got the question of China and Taiwan and the Ukraine war. So we've got plenty of things to talk about in the news next week. So maybe we can do a catch-up next week and people can kind of put in their ideas of what they want us to try to look into. But it's this overview, this attempt to tie things together, it's really difficult. And of course, anybody that does this is going to make certain mistakes and miss things. So, but Alex, you have the conspiracy angle covered. That all these false narratives that just move people away from figuring out what's going on, away from looking at big power politics and the real actors, the real big players. We've got all that going on. So anyway, I want to thank everybody for joining us. I'm Jeff Nyquist in the United States. Alex Benesch has been my co-host. He's in Germany. And we're giving two perspectives to these events. And thanks for joining us.